Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode on my channel, the Dissenter. Today I have with me a very special guest. She is Dr. Patricia Churchland. I will just do a quick introduction to her. She is a Canadian-American philosopher noted for her contributions to neurophilosophy and the philosophy of mind. She is UC President's Professor of Philosophy Emerita at the University of California, San Diego. In 2015, she was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she's also the author of a number of books, including Neurophilosophy, Toward the Unified Science of the Mind-Brain, and Brain Trust, What Neuroscience Tells Us About Morality. So, Dr. Churchland, thank you a lot for coming on the show.
It's a great pleasure.
Great. Okay, so I guess that we should start by giving a definition to people who don't know of what is neurophilosophy and what it adds to the philosophical picture in general, because we also have philosophy of mind, so what is it really about and what's the difference there?
Well, when I began thinking about what you might call neurophilosophy, I had been at the University of Manitoba Medical School for some years, and I was tremendously impressed by what we were learning about the brain and how it had an impact on traditional philosophical questions. And I wasn't so much interested in the meaning of certain words, like the meaning of perception or the meaning of free will or the meaning of choice. I really wanted to know what those things really are for us. And that means you really need to know about the brain, because our decisions are made by the brain, our perceptions are all mediated by brain functions. And so it seemed to me that there were many features of developments and new discoveries in neuroscience that had a huge impact on traditional questions. What is the nature of knowledge? Well, since we were learning a great deal about the nature of memory and learning in the brain, it seemed to me quite obvious that you couldn't really do epistemology without taking into account what we already knew about the nature of the physical brain. Mm-hmm. So that was really the motivation for me. And I suppose in the larger scheme of kind of where philosophy was then, there was this really kind of odd tradition that had a lot to do with Jerry Fodor, but I don't really want to say he started it, but where the idea was that theory of mind, or how we think about the mind, the nature of cognitive psychology should be independent of the brain. That it should be, as Jerry Fodor used to say, it should be autonomous with respect to neuroscience. And the first time I heard Jerry say that, I thought, this is just nuts. If the brain is the thing that does the thinking and the feeling and deciding and speaking, then of course you would not expect there to be a psychology that was independent of the brain. But a lot of people bought into that. And even Dan Dennett, who now thinks of himself as brain-friendly, for many, many years said there is the software and there is the hardware. And the software is the business of cognitive psychology and the hardware is the business of neuroscience, and they don't have to have anything to do with each other. And unfortunately, I was sort of a stubborn person, and I was up in Canada, and I didn't give a crap what those guys said. And it just seemed to me to be dumb. And now I think, I don't mean to be rude, because it's very easy to make a mistake in science. I think it's very clear that the idea of an autonomous psychology was just really not productive. And where we are now in cognitive neuroscience is a long, long way from Jerry Fodor's idea of the autonomy of psychology.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's interesting because at a certain point you referred there to the dichotomy between the hardware and the software. And in your book, Neurophilosophy, you spend a lot of time talking about the structure of the brain and the nervous system. So, is the structure of the brain itself, does it have sort of philosophical implications by itself, or is it only the functioning? I mean, is it important for us from a philosophical standpoint to know that it works on the basis of neurons and synapses and how it goes in terms of hormones and neurotransmitters and so on? Is that really important in terms of neurophilosophy, or does it just serve to ground all things in materialism, let's say?
No, that's a really good question. And I think the answer is that you really need to know the anatomy and the physiology of the brain. And the thing is that, and biologists have said this for a long, long time, that understanding function really is helped by understanding structure. Because out of an analysis and a description of structure, we have ideas about the nature of function. But I want to sort of do a sideways thing for a moment, and I want to tell you a story about a psychological phenomenon that we all know very well, and which we now know you can't understand or explain unless you know something not only about the brain, but about genes. So here's the story. As you know, there is a difference in efficiency of learning something depending on whether you learn it at one long go or whether you break it up into batches. And we know that batch learning, work for a while, rest for a while, work for a while, rest for a while, means that you retain much more of what it is that you were trying to learn. So psychologists, and if you were a Jerry Fodor autonomy of psychology person, what you would try to do is to give a purely psychological explanation of that. What you would do, and psychologists did this, was they said, well, it must be because people get bored, or it might, people and animals, or it must be because your attention wanders. And you only have a certain amount of attention and you use it all up and then you don't have any left. And that's why learning in one go is less efficient. And people tested this at the psychological level and nobody really, and then it turns out that in order to learn something, there has to be a physical change in a neuron. There has to be, for example, a new synapse, or there has to be a new connection between one neuron and another. And as you know, when there is a change in structure, there has to be some proteins around. Proteins have to be made and put into the make that structure.
Sure.
Well, who makes proteins? Genes make proteins. So it turns out that there is a transcription factor called CREB. And CREB will turn on certain other genes that then make the proteins that then go into synapses. Now, that all takes time. And it turns out that once you've kind of used up all the available CREB and more has to be produced by the genes, you may as well just have a rest. And it turns out then that the reason why batch learning is more efficient has to do with the temporal dynamics of producing CREB acting on other genes to produce the protein that makes the changes in the neurons. And all of this stuff about, limitations on attention and so forth, maybe in some cases it plays some role. But the real story is one that you could not have got by any kind of philosophical analysis. You could not have got it by any sort of psychological experiment. It's a physical, structural feature. So I kind of like that example because it's very easy to understand. But of course, there are many other examples as well where we need to know about what it is about neurons that does something when, for example, we make a decision. And decision making is one of those areas now where we have learned a huge amount from animal models about the nature of decision making in neurons. That means you can't, as a philosopher, just go along and make it up. You have to know.
Yeah, that's really interesting because philosophers spent 2,000 years and even more than 2,000 years trying to come up with or discover how people knew things, how people knew the world, how people apprehended the world, right?
Yes.
And discussing about what was to be considered beautiful and what was to be considered true and so on. So, in a sense, neurophilosophy combined, let's say, with philosophy of mind, they both give ground to all of these other areas of philosophy, right? Like epistemology, ethics, aesthetics.
Well, that seems to me to be right. And you know, the person who really taught me that was long, long ago. That was Paul Churchland, my husband, who said, look, these are really scientific questions. We were just graduate students at the time. And he said, philosophy of mind should be a branch of philosophy of science. It shouldn't just be this thing where you get to make up thought experiments and could it be this and could it be that? And then, you know, philosophers are very fond of making up labels for themselves and putting ism at the end, you know, so I'm a X-ism or a Y-ism or I'm a situationist or I'm a this, I'm a that. And we sort of thought, what do they imagine they're doing? These are scientific questions. They aren't questions that you can just answer by making stuff up. And of course, the other point, and I think Paul was really important in teaching me this too, is that, and as was Quine, was that if you think that the current meaning of an expression is going to tell you something about the nature of the thing that refers to, you're kind of deluding yourself. It might tell you a little bit, but it's not going to tell you very much. And it might even be that the meaning of a certain word the word itself doesn't actually apply to anything. And it could be that certain expressions which seem to be useful for a while may turn out to change a lot as science develops. And of course, the great case in point really is gene, which, because nobody knew what a gene was, except that it was a carrier of information from parents to offspring. So gene was taken from a Greek word, and it had to do with the thing that makes stuff. And we didn't know what a gene was until about 1953, when we had the first real inkling. And that meant that the meaning of the word gene changed. You couldn't give a precise definition of gene beforehand. But by 1953, even though at that early point we couldn't really define it very exactly either, that opened the door to getting greater and greater precision in the meaning of the word. And I think the same thing is true of things like knowledge or belief or decision or free will, if you like. So many philosophers hate this because they don't want to have to learn stuff. They don't want to have to learn any science. They went through graduate school being told that all they had to do was read other philosophers. And unfortunately, they took that seriously. And so they hate the idea that they need to learn about brains.
Yeah, and it's interesting now that you refer that because I didn't have these on my questions, but anyway, I now want to ask you that. You gave the example of the gene and how
Yeah.
it changed its meaning
Yeah.
via the scientific process, let's say,
Yes.
because there are people, particularly people who aren't much into philosophy, let's say, that read something of that some philosopher wrote some time ago, and then they say, "Oh, he had some pretty good intuition about something scientific that we know now." And for example, there is that very good example of Democritus of Abdera
Yeah. Yeah.
that said something like, "Oh, the universe is just atoms
Atoms in the void. I know. I know.
and the void and empty space, right?" But I mean, the notion he had of atoms didn't really correspond to the modern scientific notion we have
Yeah.
today, right?
No, but to give Democritus credit, I mean, I know we all love Democritus, of course, and I know you do too, but it was an astonishing thing to speculate that different substances are different, not because they have sort of intrinsically different natures, but because of the way the basic little bits of stuff are put together. And to think, well, gold is different from tin because the bits that make up gold are put together in a different way. And it was an important insight that I think hung around and hung around and hung around in science until experimental science had developed to a point where we could actually make it precise. And it is amazing. But then, the ancient Greeks, at least those who were naturalists, were astonishing. They truly were. And I include Aristotle in that. I mean, my God, what a visionary.
Yeah, Aristotle, we could say, was perhaps, well, I don't know if in other parts of the world there might have been someone who was close to that philosophical stance, let's say, but Aristotle, we could say that at least in the West was the first naturalist, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. And as you say, there may have been other people, for example, in India and in China, who had those ideas. I don't know as much about them, obviously, although it's very interesting that on moral issues, Confucius and Aristotle are very close. They sound very similar to me. And so I think that was kind of an astonishing thing when I first actually realized that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and now to move on perhaps to the epistemological implications that neurophilosophy has. Would you say that perhaps one intuition that was pretty close to what we know nowadays, to the knowledge we have, was that of Kant, when he said, for example, when he divided what existed, let's say, in terms of the phenomenon and the numenon, and he said that we could only have access to what he called the phenomenon because, and I'm saying this because it seems to me that what we know nowadays in terms of neuroscience is that we don't really see the world or experience the world as it is, but we only experience what our cognitive modules evolved to pay attention to, let's say.
Yeah, I don't know really how to get into that, if I may put it that way. I mean, for one thing, I could never make any sense of Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena, and finally I gave up. It's very puzzling, and I thought, is this really a productive way for me to go here to, sort of bust my chops trying to understand, what this old guy meant when there was so much that he didn't have the first idea of. He didn't know anything about evolution. He didn't know anything about the brain. He didn't know much in the way of psychology. So 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 quite honestly, I don't know what he meant. Of course, that all of our perceptions and our knowledge are mediated by the brain, but the brain is an evolved organ, and it does pretty well in sort of addressing the unobservable, or at least those things that we can't observe. I mean, who actually observes a strange quark? I mean, you can observe the effects of quarks or neutrinos or what have you. Do I get metaphysically very excited about the fact that I can't directly observe, a quark or a neutrino? No, actually, I don't. I mean, there's a lot of things I can get very excited about. But the fact that nobody has ever seen or may ever see with the naked eye, I'm sure they won't ever see with the naked eye a neutrino, doesn't make any difference to me. I mean, that seems to me to be not very interesting, if you know what I mean. Whereas, I mean, the idea of quantum entanglement, or that there are these things that we think of as neutrinos, that's pretty interesting. But the fact that I can't actually observe one with unaided doesn't interest me very much at all. Like, oh, big deal. I mean, I can't see very much without my glasses either, so big deal.
Okay, right. And would you say that because nowadays we know, particularly from evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, and neuroscience and so on, that we have these sort of cognitive modules that, in a sense, have some a priori knowledge of the world, because we have structures of the brain that are specialized to deal with certain specific problems, and so they are prepared to do that beforehand.
Who says that? Who says that? Who says that? That we have brain modules that are a priori structured to do certain things.
Oh, the a priori part, it's mine. I put it just to ask you if what we know nowadays about the way our brain functions and the problems we are evolutionarily prepared to deal with, if we could talk about if you could talk about a priori knowledge like some more ancient philosophers did.
Well, first of all, it remains really puzzling in neuroscience exactly how the brain is organized. And normally, of course, it's true that at the back of your brain you have the visual cortex, and that's what's really important when you do visual perception. But it's not like it's hardwired for that. And we know that for a number of reasons. Here's one really interesting one. If you are born blind and you learn to read Braille, and you're put in a scanner while you're reading Braille, functional magnetic resonance imaging, what part of the brain do you think is going to be super important for reading Braille? Now, I would have said the somatosensory cortex up here, and I would have been wrong. It's the visual cortex. Mm-hmm. Why? Well, probably because for perceptual cortex, the biggest part and the part that carries, as it were, the highest degree of sophisticated processing is visual cortex. So when you have a really complex problem and your visual cortex is not doing anything, it does that problem. Now, what does that mean if you have this idea that there are these cognitive modules that solve particular problems? Like Tuvey and Cosmody still think that there is a cortical module for solving the problem of detecting cheaters. There is no reason that I can see in neuroscience to believe that that's true. So from a psychological point of view, they find that an agreeable idea. And maybe it will turn out that the brain has such a module, but there's no real reason to think that it does. And so I want to go back to a point I made earlier, which is that there's so much we still profoundly do not understand about how the brain codes information and how the brain is organized. And the modularity thesis, of at least of the kind that Jerry Fodor was fond of, has really taken a beating. It does not look like it's very plausible. Granted, in a mature individual whose sensory apparatus is all normal, the visual cortex processes visual information. But that may be owed not to a priori knowledge in any sense at all, but just because given the input and given the statistics of the input into the visual cortex is the best thing to handle that. And so there is a school of thought, and I don't want to say we know this, but there is a school of thought whereby it's very plausible that it's the statistics of the input that determine whether or not you see versus feel versus hear and so forth. So the auditory cortex is auditory because of the statistics of the input that come in through the auditory nerve. It's not because, some Fodorian god said, thou shalt be an auditory module. And we kind of don't know about so-called higher functions, things that the frontal cortex does. We know in mature individuals that frontal structures are important in decision-making and inhibiting undesired responses and so forth. But we really don't, the idea that there is a module for voluntary choice, for example, is not neurobiologically plausible at this point, which isn't to say we know what is plausible. There are many, many unanswered questions in neuroscience, and I'm quite happy to be patient as opposed to making stuff up. I'd prefer to be patient and let the data come in and then be guided by the data than just say, oh yes, we know there's got to be cognitive modules right there above the eye that handle such things as social cognition. Yeah, nobody knows that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but just to try to be fair to Dr. Cosmides, because I already had her on the show. And
Good.
And I asked her specifically about if the cognitive modules she and Dr. Tooby and others talked about would correspond to something that is very particularly physic in the brain. And I asked her if it would be something in the connectome or some specific region or area in the brain, and what she answered was that she was not really particularly interested in trying to locate the modules in the brain, and she even said that she wasn't trying to do any sort of phrenology here, so perhaps what I understood she meant by cognitive module is that there's some sort of combinatorial operations that the brain does in order to try to solve the problems we learn to solve throughout our evolutionary history, something like that.
Well, we know that the brain is a big problem solver, but okay, so here's an example that puzzles me if we think about, we know that Homo erectus about at least 1.5 million years ago made boats. All right. And we know that just about every hunter-gatherer group that lives anywhere near a body of water makes a boat. And it might be kayaks, or canoes, or rafts, or all kinds of stuff. Is there a boat-making module? Probably not. There's probably all kinds of problem-solving in a practical context. But the fact that Homo erectus and Homo neanderthalis, as well as us guys, we Homo sapiens, have made boats, and probably maybe even before Homo erectus, for all I know, doesn't mean that there is a boat-making cognitive module. I mean, almost certainly there is no boat-making module at the neurobiological level. But what we really don't know is how neurobiology, our brains, solve those kinds of problems about making a boat. And there's no real reason to think that as boat building became better and better, you know, as you went from rafts, say, to canoes to and so forth, that somehow there were evolutionary changes in the brain that made this a priori knowledge, or made this knowledge get built in. There's not the slightest reason to think that. So I would prefer myself to sort of wait until we have a much deeper understanding of the nature of problem solving. And rather than sort of advance the idea that there are cognitive modules, and that when somebody has a particular kind of problem, the problem is with their cognitive module. I mean, bear in mind that people used to say this with regard to dyslexia. And one of the really profoundly important discoveries in neuroscience was made by a neuroscientist, Paula Talal. And what Talal found was that unless there are other kinds of frank neurological damage, if a child is dyslexic, it's not because their reading module is busted. It's because in regions we don't really know, but somewhere in the auditory system, they have a difficulty processing high temporal, that is, features that come in a very fast temporal sequence. If you slow things down, then they're usually able to do the processing. So it didn't have anything specific to do with reading at all. It just manifested itself first in spoken language. And because the spoken language wasn't functioning as it needed to, they couldn't process phonemes fast enough, it manifested itself in written language. So, but there were certainly people who argued at the time, oh yeah, there's a reading module. But, you know, reading's only been around 5,000 years. So how could the brain has not evolved significantly in the cognitive domain in the last 5,000 years, probably not in the last couple of 100,000 years. It's evolved. I mean, we've evolved in terms of digestive enzymes and a few other things, but your brain is much like the brain of somebody, or at least at birth, would be like the brain of a Homo sapiens baby born 300,000 years ago. So yeah, maybe there are cognitive modules, but the case is very weak at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but just another thing about that, and then we will move on to another topic. That is, of course, we also have culture and cultural evolution, and I also already talked with Dr. Robert Boyd, for example, that is one of the leading figures in terms of cultural evolution.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty clear that, for example, to build a boat, we couldn't simply do it based on some a priori knowledge, let's say. We have to have other things, particularly things that are transmitted by culture through the generations, right? But I don't want to put words in your mouth, but aren't you thinking about cognitive modules in terms of them being sort of encapsulated as Jerry Fodor put them? Because when I talked with Dr. Cosmidi, she even said that she was a bit frustrated because of the way Jerry Fodor presented modularity back in the 80s or something, because she and Dr. Tooby didn't really ever thought about modules in terms of them being isolated entities, but that they could combine with each other, for example.
Yeah, then I'm just a little puzzled about what constitutes a module. I mean, what does a psychological phenomenon have to be in order to be called a cognitive module? I mean, if boat building isn't a cognitive module, why is cheater detection a cognitive module? And a lot of folks are not very good at cheater detection. I mean, I just watched this amazing documentary about the Bhagwan Rajneesh, and here were these thousands of people who sort of gave all kinds of money and were dressed in a funny way in order to, and there were lots of people with college degrees and so forth who joined this cult, and he was just a con man. And I thought, if there are cheater detection modules, what's going on with these folks? People are conned all the time. You have to really, you have to be conned a few times, and then you learn and you think, oh boy, I'm not going to let that happen again. And kids are regularly instructed by their parents not to be conned. I don't think cheater detection is one of the things that comes so naturally to people at all. And that's why we are very easily conned. We can be cheated on all the time. We don't want to talk about current politics, but there are commentators who talk about the current political atmosphere in the United States in terms of con men and so forth. So hey, a cheater detection module? Maybe there's a few people who have it, but there's a heck of a lot of us who don't have one.
Right. Okay, so I guess we will leave this issue perhaps to another day or to other people, just to move forward, because I have other topics I want to discuss with you. And the next one is, of course, one of the major topics of philosophy of mind, that is consciousness. So we have the easy problems and the hard problems of consciousness, right? The easy problems are basically explaining our ability to discriminate, integrate information, reporting mental states, and so on, and knowing, for example, the particular areas in the brain that process each of those kinds of information. But then we have a very complicated thing that there are people that think that it will never be, science will never be able to solve it. That is the hard problem. That is to trying to explain the phenomenology part of consciousness, right? And how we acquire, for example, how we have the experience of taste and color and things like that. So what would you have to say about that?
Well, it is a prediction to say that science will never understand it. And it's some of the most scientifically naive people, like Colin McGinn, who've said that. So I'm thinking, that's a pretty strong prediction. Why would I believe Colin McGinn? And maybe the prediction is correct, but it's also a fact that there have been many, many predictions about what science could never explain, right? And Francis Crick was fond of telling us that there were people who would say, you'll never explain the nature of living, what it is to be a living thing, because of course it involves élan vital, and science will never explain it. So there are still things we don't entirely understand about the nature of metabolism or the nature of gene regulation and so forth, but there's an awful lot we do understand. So much so that you'd be hard put to it to find somebody now who'd say you'll never understand the nature of what it is to be alive. So I don't know. I mean, scientists or philosophers who don't know very much, making a prediction about what science will and won't discover strikes me as hilarious. On the other hand, it's also the case that there are some scientists who have made similar kinds of predictions. But again, these are predictions. And so, why should I take it seriously? But the sort of real point, I think, is that what do they think that should be the upshot of this prediction? Should it be that we shouldn't even try? Should it be that we shouldn't try to find out how anesthesia works, for example? Should it be that we shouldn't try to find out how sensory integration works? Or, I mean, what do they think we shouldn't do anymore, that we're wasting our time if consciousness can never be explained? I mean, there's a big difference between being in deep sleep and not, in terms of consciousness. Is Colin McGinn telling us that we don't need to bother understanding that because it'll never be explained? I mean, I'd really like to know what that difference is. And moreover, as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of progress has been made in understanding the difference between being in deep sleep, being in dreaming sleep, and being awake. And some of those differences are highly relevant to the idea of sensory integration and the experience of phenomena like touch and smell and vision and so forth. So I mean, one of the people who used to say, it's the hard problem is Christoph Koch, but it's very interesting that Christoph now, largely because of the effect of Tononi, thinks that we can actually make an awful lot of progress and that there's no point in stopping until you're sure you can't go any further. And of course, you can never be sure you can't go any further. All you could say is, I'm stumped. But that doesn't mean some wonderful graduate student is going to be stumped. That wonderful graduate student might figure it out. So it seems to me that insofar as it's a project worth getting to the bottom of, that it's important to understand the role of, for example, the interlaminar nuclei in the thalamus. Why do I pick that? Because we know that for people who have been in coma for a very long time, like in one case, 7 years, but whose cortex and other structures are still intact, if you stimulate the interlaminar nuclei of the thalamus, they wake up. They're conscious again. They come out of coma. That's a pretty amazing result. That's owed to Nick Schiff at the Cornell Weill Medical School in New York. That's a very important result. Does Colin McGinn think it's uninteresting? I can't imagine he thinks it's uninteresting. And it's certainly relevant to beginning to explain the nature of consciousness. So that's kind of my response is, look, it's some of these guys like McGinn in particular have sort of made their reputation by saying these rather extraordinary things. Like it makes them sound like they're really smart, that they know we'll never explain consciousness. Well, I mean, really, that's silly. It is. It's just silly. I mean, I can't take something like that seriously.
Yeah, and then on the other hand, we have people that are working a lot on trying to understand how consciousness works, and I have specifically to talk about this because he is also my compatriot, that is António Damásio, right?
Yes, yeah. He is. Yes, he is.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, and he has this hierarchy of stages of consciousness, right? He starts with and I'm going to talk a little bit about this now just for the audience, that he starts with the proto-self, that is kind of the most basic level of awareness, and that is integrated, it's kind of integrating all the emotions that are produced by the body at the level of the hypothalamus, the brainstem, the insular cortex, and I think those are the three main areas. And then he moves on and adds a sort of another layer to it, that is core consciousness. That is when emotions develop into feelings. And we also share a lot of these with some animals, or a lot of them even. And then he adds a third layer, let's say, that he calls extended consciousness, and this is exclusive to humans, that requires conventional memory and allows for the development of the autobiographical self. So do you think that this work that Damásio and others are doing gives us a good promise of us being able to completely understand how consciousness builds from the periphery of the body, because this includes the way the rest of the body processes information to create emotions, and then builds up from that, from there until the really higher processes that occur in the brain?
No, it's an interesting question. I was never quite sure in his organizational picture why the emotions had a more basic role than, say, other forms of perception. I was also never quite sure why he thought that the emotions represent states of the body. I mean, I know that there is some relationship between the periphery, touches on the skin and so forth, but I think there may be some updating from Ralph Adolphs and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of his co-author on the emotions, but I think the emotions are an extremely important part of the story, but I don't know. I mean, maybe it'll end up being a very productive framework. I'm not sure that I can quite get my mind around how that is at the moment. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what to say about that.
But is your issue specifically with the part about emotions, or aren't you in general a big fan of, for example, embodied cognition?
Gosh, well, I mean, the thing about the embodied cognition story is that there are some things about it that make a lot of sense, and there are some things that kind of, are an exaggeration of what makes sense to me. These are big deep issues, and I don't really want to get into a whole sort of discussion about what I think is unhelpful, shall we say, about the embodied cognition story. I mean, obviously, if I didn't have a body, or if parts of my body were very different from how they are, then, yeah. But I mean, part of what, for me, I think fails to really grip me in the Damásio story is its neurobiological mechanisms. I mean, it's a kind of story that is more, I don't know whether this is accurate or not, but it seems more psychological than it is neurobiological. And I think when people are talking about explaining consciousness, what we'd really like to have is a neurobiological account of mechanisms, such that we can understand, say, the difference between being in deep sleep and not. And the idea that there's core consciousness, well, I mean, I don't know, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I think it might be a useful start. It might be a useful way of organizing the data that are there. But I mean, you have to, I mean, these are, one's take on scientific hypotheses is sometimes quite personal. And I'm a bit of a stubborn person. I'm a sort of a tough customer. That is, I don't like to just jump on a bandwagon and off we go. And partly because there have been so many bandwagons that people have jumped on, and then they've ended up going in exactly the wrong direction. And so I tend to be a little bit skeptical. And it's not because I have a personal thing about the author of an idea, so much as that I just kind of want to reserve judgment unless the data are clear and compelling. And I don't see in the Damásio story that we have clear and compelling data yet. Maybe they will come, and, you know, but I don't see it yet. And I'm not the only one who is sort of taking a wait-and-see attitude amongst neuroscientists. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's fair enough, and as you might have already noticed, I only like to pose easy questions, right?
Yeah. No, I know. No, these are very difficult, and it's important that we have all kinds of ideas about how things work. But it's also important. I mean, Francis Crick used to say, you know, it's really important not to fall in love with your idea, not to fall in love with your theory. And so I mean, maybe that affected me in the sense that I don't like to fall in love with just anybody's theory because they've got a story about, you know, levels of something or other, levels of consciousness, or I think, yeah, well, how do you know there's only 3? How do you know there's not 20? How do you know that there's not just one? And that what's below the level of consciousness isn't really part of consciousness at all. I mean, that's what Bernie Bars would say. That's probably what I would say. If it's not in consciousness, why call it lower level consciousness? Why don't you just say you're not conscious of that stuff? But, you know, as I said, it's good that there are people who are willing to theorize. But it's also important that we don't get too excited about the theories until, you know, they've really got solid evidence on their behalf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, on my side, I have to be patriotic here, you know, otherwise people won't like what I'm doing.
Yes, so. I know that he is held in great regard, and he's been an old friend for a very long time. And I'm very frank with him when I disagree with him, which he doesn't always like, but that's okay too.